Welcome to the Best Practices in Budget Development training for fiscal year 2023 AmeriCorps State and National Public Health AmeriCorps applicants. I appreciate you taking the time to consider the best ways to develop a compliant and competitive AmeriCorps budget. During this recording, I will share several sample budget narrative entries. A full sample budget is posted on the fiscal year 2023 AmeriCorps State and National Public Health AmeriCorps funding page for your reference. As a follow-up to this training, AmeriCorps' Office of Grant Administration will host a live budget development office hour on Wednesday, December 7th from 2:30 till 3:30 p.m. Eastern Time. Registration details for that session are available on the competition funding page and at the end of this training. Please be aware that during the office hour, AmeriCorps staff will not respond to questions about the specific content of your proposed budget. Rather, we will provide clarifications to help applicants submit a compliant budget. I encourage you to note any questions that come to mind as you review this training, and if they are not addressed by the end of the recording, bring them to that office hour webinar. My goal for today's session is to help you, the Public Health AmeriCorps grant applicant, acquire the knowledge and skills needed to understand the function of and develop an effective Public Health AmeriCorps budget and budget narrative. Your submission of a complete and high-quality budget will help to demonstrate that you have the fiscal capacity to manage an AmeriCorps program. During this session, I will holistically review the components of an AmeriCorps budget. At the end, applicants should understand how to determine if costs are allowable, reasonable, necessary, and allocable as determined by 2 CFR 200, the Office of Management and Budget's Uniform Administrative Requirements, Cost Principles, and Audit Requirements for Federal Awards, frequently referred to as the Uniform Guidance. Using this information and the tips and best practices shared here, applicants should be prepared to submit a compliant and competitive budget. Because the budget and budget narrative becomes part of the grant recipient's contract with AmeriCorps, AmeriCorps wants and expects applicants to present a strong and accurate document. The approved budget will not only serve as a financial guide for grant-supported activities, but it helps to ensure compliance with the terms and conditions of the award. In addition to helping AmeriCorps monitor grant and financial compliance, it can serve as a tool for both AmeriCorps and award recipients to measure progress toward any match requirements and for grantees to monitor budgeted expenses to actual expenses, a key part of the funds management process. Before I dive into the details of budget development, I want to point out that budget development is just one component of an effective budget and funds management process. Let's take a quick look at the full process. As you started to work on your Public Health AmeriCorps application, you may have asked yourself, how do I design a strong budget? Whether you started the process with that question or not, as part of the pre-award project development process, it's likely that your team already determined the needs you wanted to address with AmeriCorps resources, that you set up program or project goals and objectives, and you decided on a strategy to accomplish those goals. To develop the budget, applicants must translate that strategy into dollars to prepare a budget that is aligned with the stated program goals and objectives. Post-award, grantees will continue to manage their budgets effectively by establishing a budget control process, monitoring expenses, that is, regularly comparing budgeted to actual expenses to check for over and underspending, and then modifying the budget as necessary with approval from AmeriCorps when required. Your budget control process and ongoing monitoring of expenses are key components of funds management. I highlight the importance of funds management now during the application process so that it is something you are aware of and can plan for should AmeriCorps grant your award. Funds management is very important to AmeriCorps and to the federal government as a whole. We are introducing some new grantee trainings related to funds management over the coming months to support you should AmeriCorps approve your application. Applicants can find those trainings on the Manage Your Grant page of the AmeriCorps.gov website. For now, let's go back to the budget preparation process, which is the focus of today's conversation. Let's talk about an approved budget. It should be realistic. That is, it should reflect expected program revenues and expenses and its capacity to carry out program activities. It should also be consistent and aligned with the program's goals and objectives. And it should be flexible. A project's financial and operating circumstances often change, and the budget must adapt to those changing circumstances. For now, we will focus on the realistic and consistent features as they relate to budget design. Now, a few minutes ago, I outlined the steps that your team may have taken as part of the budget development process. AmeriCorps encourages applicants to approach budget design as a team activity, engaging various departments based on their individual expertise. Let's consider the various departments or individuals in your organization that you could engage on your budget design team and the specific expertise they bring to the process. Your human resources team will likely have salary, fringe benefits, and criminal history check costs. The program office may know the cost for training members and delivering services to the community. The accounting office will have historical spending rates for specific costs, and your grants office should be able to review for compliance. And certainly other staff may have additional expertise and can review your budget for clarity. Now, I certainly realize if you are part of a small organization, you may not have all these resources available to you, but that doesn't mean you should undertake budget development in a vacuum without input from others. Don't be afraid to involve as many others as is required, including your organization's leadership, in order to present the most realistic data in the budget and to make sure the document aligns with your programmatic goals and objectives. AmeriCorps recommends that applicants use historical information when it is possible, and as a reminder, your accounting department should have that information. And then you will just adjust it as necessary so that the data is timelier, and include that information as appropriate as part of the budget narrative descriptions. Your strong budget design provides a framework for effective budget management, and it ensures a realistic scope, appropriate detail, a competitive proposal, compliance, and effective delivery. That is, it serves as a guide for program implementation. In order to create a budget that is strong, accurate, and requires minimal resolution, I encourage applicants to take their time and engage others in data collection and quality review. As I previously noted, one of the objectives for this session is to provide applicants with tips and tools for creating a competitive budget narrative. The first tip is to read and follow the instructions in the Notice of Funding Opportunity, also referenced as the NOFO or the notice, and in the application instructions, which include the minimum and maximum cost levels and required line items, both of which I will discuss later in this presentation. Within the application instructions, applicants will find detailed budget instructions for cost reimbursement grants in attachments B and C. The strongest and most compliant budget narratives adhere to the guidelines in these documents, and that saves all of us time and effort later. I also encourage applicants to become familiar with the uniform guidance and only include those costs that are allowable, reasonable, necessary, and allocable. Applicants can find this online at ecfr.federalregister.gov under Title II, Grants and Agreements. After your team estimates the financial resources you need to achieve the stated program goals, you will organize them into the narrative's budget categories, again following the guidance in the notice and the application instructions. As you develop the narrative, remember to provide adequate descriptions and clear calculations. eGrants will automatically populate a budget summary and a budget narrative report that should be able to serve as a standalone document without a need to reference the application narrative for explanation. For this reason, I always recommend having someone outside of your budget development team review the document to check for any holes and inaccuracies. The uniform guidance, as well as the notice and application instructions, specify costs that are considered unallowable, such as lobbying, entertainment, alcoholic beverages, and fundraising. AmeriCorps strongly encourages applicants to review the uniform guidance to avoid including unallowable costs in your proposed budget. Other unallowable costs include those that are not necessary to meet the program objectives. For example, budgeting AmeriCorps symposium travel expenses for 6 staff members when only 4 staff are included in the AmeriCorps budget is not allowable and could be waste, fraud, or abuse. Another example is budgeting $6,000 for landscaping equipment and materials for a Public Health AmeriCorps program. These are costs that would be considered unreasonable from a prudent person perspective or have no logical basis for inclusion in the budget. It is important to remember that if a cost is unallowable as part of the AmeriCorps share, it is also unallowable as part of the grantee share, also referenced as the cost share or match. While there is no match requirement for Public Health AmeriCorps grants, Public Health AmeriCorps applicants may choose to include a grantee share of program costs in the budget to demonstrate the additional resources required for program operation. Cash and in-kind contributions are acceptable match when they are necessary and reasonable for proper and efficient accomplishment of project or program objectives, when they are allowable under the uniform guidance and application instructions, when they are included in the approved budget and allocable under program guidelines, and when they are compliant with the terms and conditions of the award and the uniform guidance, and when they are verifiable from the organization's records. When included in an AmeriCorps budget, the matching resources must be treated the same as the AmeriCorps share, and consistent treatment includes complete and accurate documentation. A frequently heard phrase in the world of grants management is, if it isn't documented, it didn't happen. Please make sure to document all your expenses. If you choose to include non-AmeriCorps support in your Public Health AmeriCorps application, you must document the source of matching funds in the budget narrative that equals the amount of budgeted match exactly. When populating the source of funds section, applicants will enter a description of the source along with the amount, a cash or in-kind classification, the type of match source, that is, whether it's coming from state or local government, federal funds, or private donations, and a confirmation of whether the sources of match are secured or proposed. The source of funds is only required if applicants include any proposed cost in the grantee share of the budget. As applicants enter data into the budget narrative, they will notice that it includes both the AmeriCorps and grantee share of project costs. Additionally, the budget classifies costs into direct and administrative or indirect cost categories. Direct costs include program operating costs and member costs, which the budget breaks into major categories that may include specific line items such as those shown on the slide. These costs are allocable to the grant. That is, they are associated with grant-related goals and activities. General or centralized organizational expenses spread across the entire organization in support of common goals are indirect or administrative costs. As you, the Public Health AmeriCorps applicant, develop your budget management systems, and specifically the budget control and funds management processes, you will want to establish clear policies and procedures for tracking and documenting these expenses if you don't already have them. I will now review the specific budget categories and the related guidance in the AmeriCorps application instructions, beginning with the Section 1, Program Operating Costs. In Section A, Personnel Expenses, applicants will individually list each staff position supported by the grant and provide the annual salary and level of effort as a percentage of the full-time equivalent, or FTE, devoted to the award. Please remember to only include positions supported by the application narrative and make sure not to include the value of direct community service performed by volunteers unless it is for organizational functions such as accounting or auditing or training. In addition, if you have other AmeriCorps grants, it's often a good idea to confirm that you are not over budgeting, that is, including more than 100% of staff time on those budgets. Applicants can do this by including a statement in each line or at the end of the section that states the percentage of time allocated to budgeted staff does not exceed 100% across all AmeriCorps grants. Additionally, applicants should confirm that the salary information provided is consistent across the multiple grants. While it may be appropriate to budget the executive director's salary as $89,000 on one application and $99,000 on the application that you submit 6 months later, you could add an explanation that the higher salary reflects a cost of living or a performance-related salary increase for additional clarification. In Section 1B, Fringe Benefits, applicants will identify the type of fringe benefit, for example, FICA, health and life insurance, workers' compensation, state unemployment, retirement costs, and so on. And you'll also include the cost for each staff member. Note that fringe benefit costs should align with the salary lines. That is, the section should only include staff included in the personnel expenses category. If a benefit amount is more than 30% of the related salary costs, applicants must list the covered benefits separately and justify the cost. Now, that doesn't mean that applicants need to break out each expense into its own line item. You could actually state something like health insurance at 24%, retirement at 10%, and FICA at 7.65%, rather than noting that fringe benefits are 41.65% of the related salary costs. In Section 1C, Travel, you will include the purpose of costs and the type of travel costs, such as airfare, ground transportation, lodging, or per diem costs. You'll also include the number of trips and the number of staff or member traveling. Make sure that the calculation is clear and it's simple to follow. Please do note that attendance at AmeriCorps-sponsored technical assistance meetings, including the annual symposium, is an expectation of all direct grantees, and travel funds should be budgeted for new grantees and new staff of existing grantees to attend the AmeriCorps Symposium pre-conference events. Do take care to separate staff and member travel costs and ensure that the training costs are not included in this section, and vice versa, that travel costs are not included in training lines. Also be aware that applicants may budget mileage at a rate higher than the federal reimbursement rate, which as of July 1st, 2022 is 62.5 cents per mile. And you can budget that if it follows the organization's policy. If it does, please make a note of that in the budget narrative. Otherwise, your mileage rate should not exceed the federal rate. Section 1D is the equipment category. And here, expenses are defined the equipment expenses are defined as tangible, non-expendable personal property having a useful life of more than 1 year and an acquisition cost of $5,000 or more per unit. If less, that expense goes into the supplies section, no matter how your organization defines equipment. So again, if it's $5,000 or more per unit, it's considered equipment. If it's less than that, it is considered supplies. Also, do be aware that equipment is limited to 10% of the total AmeriCorps funds requested. Applicants must show the unit cost and the number of units with the purpose of the equipment in the budget. Again, your supply costs are those costs that are consumable supplies and materials, including member service gear, and they've got an individual cost of less than $5,000 per unit. AmeriCorps identity items, preferably clothing with an AmeriCorps logo, is a required budget expense, and it may be charged to the AmeriCorps share only if it includes the AmeriCorps logo. Applicants should make a note in the budget narrative when items include the AmeriCorps logo. Applicants may charge safety gear to the AmeriCorps share regardless of whether it has a logo. Organizations must purchase any non-logoed member service gear with non-AmeriCorps funds. And do make sure to individually list single items costing $1,000 or more. In section 1F, you will find the contractual and consultant services line items. Here you will include all contractual and consultant services except training and evaluation consultants. And while AmeriCorps does not impose a maximum daily rate, we ask that applicants include a basis on which they determine the expense, which may be a daily rate, it may be an hourly rate, it may be a contractual rate for a certain number of days, hours, or products. Again, I will remind you not to include the value of direct community service performed by volunteers here or in the personnel expenses section unless it's for organizational functions such as accounting, auditing, equipment maintenance, things like that. In section G, we'll have the training costs, and that includes expenses related to both staff and member training. Staff training will enhance the staff skills for effective project implementation, where member training supports members as they carry out their service activities, and it may include Life After AmeriCorps training. Again, I will remind you to include a daily rate for consultants if you're using one, and if not, to enter some type of detail to justify the costs. Before moving out of this category, I want to speak briefly to the inclusion of food costs in the training section, which is often a topic of concern. Please be aware that food provided during the dissemination of information, such as a training event, is allowable. Additionally, if breaking for participants to go off-site for food would be time-consuming due to logistics, food could also be allowable. When proposing the inclusion of food in this section, applicants should make note of situations like I just described in the budget narrative justification. Section 1H is the evaluation costs section, and that includes project evaluation costs such as additional staff, consultants, evaluation instruments, and so on. This is not for assessing progress toward performance measures, but it's an evaluation of the impact on the community and the assessment of the overall program design and systems. Again, if you're using a daily rate, you'll want to include that here or whatever justification you have for the cost. And in section 1I, you will find other program operating costs. And that's a bit of a catch-all category for those project expenses that don't neatly fit into other categories. Here, applicants must include National Service criminal history checks for members, employees, and others who receive a salary, education award, living allowance, or stipend. And if it's not included, explain how those costs are covered or that the checks are already completed. You may also include costs like office space, utilities, phone, internet, and similar expenses for both members and project staff, providing that the expenses are not included as part of the organization's approved indirect cost rate and that they are prorated and appropriately allocated to the project. Applicants may also include member recognition costs, which are allowable if appropriately justified, and if they exclude gifts and food provided in an entertainment setting. And finally, multi-state applicants may include subgrants in this section, indicating the approximate number and average amount of the awards. And if there's any required subgrantee match, you'll want to show that in the grantee share column. So let's review some budget narrative sample entries that include a few errors so that you can avoid those errors in your own budget. This staff travel section includes a number of errors. The applicant included the AmeriCorps-sponsored grantee training, but they neglected to include a cost calculation to explain how they determined the $2,930. And while this is a required line item, the cost in it may not meet the prudent person standard. For example, what if this line item was for a training in DC, as is shown here, and those travelers were in Northern Virginia? It seems that it would not cost nearly $3,000 for that amount of travel. So that's where you'll want to add some additional information in that calculation section to justify this and show that it is a reasonable and necessary cost. In the second line item, the applicant proposed a mileage rate that is higher than the current federal rate. Again, this could be allowable if it aligns with the organization's policy. The applicant could have avoided having to clarify the rate by making a budget narrative notation that this follows the organization's travel policy. And an example of that is included on the last line of this section. The third line item shows that the applicant did not double check the calculations for accuracy. The details in the description total $2,050 rather than the budgeted amount of $1,954. This often results when applicants revise the budget sections and then they forget to go back and double check. And that's why I say that you can't double check those calculations too many times. The last line in this section includes costs for member travel. And while member travel is an allowable cost, and this is an appropriately detailed entry, there is a specific member travel section in the budget. It's important to check that you are entering all of your line items in the appropriate sections. The example at the bottom of the slide shows a correct and comprehensive entry. Adequate detail is included for each line item, including the number of individuals traveling, the number of travel days or miles traveled, and the mileage rate. And all of the calculations total the budgeted amounts, and there are no erroneous costs included in this section. Here's a sample from the supplies section of a budget narrative that includes proposed costs that might require resolution. In the first line, the applicant provided an average monthly cost of the office supplies, but the calculation is incorrect. It appears to be based on only 10 months of costs. The computers line item is budgeted as $2,200 and includes no detail, so we don't know how many computers the applicant is proposing to buy, and if this line is for just computers or if other items are included. Without this detail, we can't determine if the cost is reasonable and necessary. Also remember that the application instructions state that applicants must specify all single supply items with a cost of more than $1,000 per unit. So if this is $2,200 for a single unit, or even if it's $1,100, we don't know that, and they need to provide that type of specificity. The member supply section includes a cost per member and the number of members, which is great. However, when you calculate it, It totals a bit higher than what is budgeted. It totals $6,080. Because AmeriCorps budget reviews include an assessment of calculation accuracy, I recommend adding a term such as average or approximate to this description, similar to the one that is included in the office supplies line, and that gives a little bit of flexibility. As I reviewed this sample, I also noticed that it doesn't include the AmeriCorps member service gear, which is a required line item. The second version includes the member service gear with the appropriate amount of detail. The additional revisions include the corrected office supplies calculation, details about the computers, and the term approximate in the member supply line. This is a much better and a more compliant budget narrative section. Let's move on to section 2, which focuses on member costs, specifically member living allowances and support costs. The notice stipulates the minimum and maximum living allowances. For example, it states that the Public Health AmeriCorps full-time living allowance ranges between $17,600 and $35,200 per member. The budget narrative must identify the number of members in each category and the living allowance amount they will receive. Member support costs must follow the laws of the states where the members serve. FICA, unless exempted by the IRS, is calculated at 7.65% of the total living allowances. Applicants must offer health care to all full-time members. Programs may not pay health care benefits to less than full-time members with grant funds unless those less than full-time members are serving in a full-time capacity for a sustained period of time, such as in a full-time summer program. In that case, applicants should note that in the budget narrative. Please include the number of members receiving the benefit and a per-person cost in the cost calculation. If you calculate costs based on the percentage of members that historically accept or that you anticipate will accept a benefit, please make sure to note that in your justification. Applicants may include workers' compensation costs if the state where the members are serving requires it. If it is not required, programs must obtain occupational, accidental death, and dismemberment coverage for the members. Be aware that it is the applicant's responsibility to check with the State Department of Labor to determine if you are required to pay workers' compensation, and if so, at what level. Unemployment insurance and other member support costs must also include adequate calculation details. Applicants may not charge the cost of unemployment insurance taxes to the grant unless it is mandated by state law. Let's now consider a sample member support cost section that includes some errors. This applicant included the required FICA for members, but they calculated it incorrectly. Although the math is correct, according to the application instructions, applicants must calculate FICA using a rate of 7.65% of total living allowances. In the healthcare section, the applicant seems to have estimated that a percentage of eligible members will decline the benefit. There is no requirement that applicants provide healthcare benefits to all full-time members, only that they offer it to all full-time members. When applicants budget for less than all full-time members, they generally base it on some historical information. The inclusion of the term estimated, again, provides some flexibility should more or fewer members accept that benefit. It's important to note if you estimate that fewer than all members will accept the coverage, as a grantee, you must be prepared to cover the related costs and amend the budget as needed if more members accept the coverage. This healthcare line also includes healthcare benefits for 8 of the 10 half-time members. This might be allowable, but only if those half-time members are serving in a full-time capacity, such as a full-time summer program. If this was part of a submitted budget, it would likely result in a request for confirmation that these are less than full-time members serving in a full-time capacity. Otherwise, that cost is unallowable. Are there any other required line items missing here? How about the workers' compensation line that the application instructions state is a required line item if the state requires worker compensation coverage for AmeriCorps members? If the state does not, AmeriCorps requires grantees to obtain occupational, accidental death, and dismemberment coverage for members. One of these two costs must be included in the budget. The second example here includes the correct FICA calculation. Additionally, the healthcare line item was corrected to exclude the half-time members that apparently were not serving in a full-time capacity. And this example includes a line for the required member workers' compensation costs. Although, as you see in this example, the applicant is covering the cost of the benefit, but chose not to include the matching funds on the budget, since match is not required of Public Health AmeriCorps applicants. The additional language in this line item confirms that the applicant is providing the coverage off budget, which will help the applicant avoid the need to clarify it during the resolution process. Administrative costs are general or centralized costs that support the project. They do not include specific project costs. They may be included in an organization's indirect cost rate agreement if one exists. Public Health AmeriCorps applicants who choose to include administrative costs in their budgets have three methods available for calculating them in Section 3 of the budget. Each method is thoroughly detailed in the application instructions. Using the corporation fixed percentage method, which is also referenced as the 5-10% fixed administrative cost option in the application instructions, applicants may charge administrative costs without a federally approved indirect cost rate and without documentation to support the allocation. Using this method, applicants can allocate 5% of the AmeriCorps share of direct costs to the AmeriCorps share of administrative costs, and 10% of all direct costs, that is the total of both the AmeriCorps and the grantee shares, to the grantee share of administrative costs. Applicants should follow the guidance in the application instructions to calculate the maximum allowed. If allocating less than the maximum allowed, please note the percentage claimed in the budget narrative. If applicants have a federally approved indirect cost rate, they must use this method, and the approved rate agreement constitutes documentation of the administrative costs. Again, the AmeriCorps share is limited to 5% of the AmeriCorps funds. Be sure to specify the cost type, whether it's provisional, predetermined, fixed, or final, and supply the rate and the base on which it is calculated. Some may be calculated based on salaries, or salaries and fringe benefits, or modified total direct costs, or some other base, but you'll want to include whatever that base is. And then you will follow the guidance in the application instructions to calculate the maximum allowed. Again, if allocating less than the maximum, note the percentage claimed. Applicants must also enter the details of their approved negotiated indirect cost rate agreement in eGrants using the guidance in the application instructions. The third calculation method available to organizations who do not have a federally negotiated indirect cost rate and who receive less than $35 million in direct federal funding is the de minimis rate of 10% of modified total direct costs. It's important to note that if this option is elected, the organization must use it consistently across all the organization's federal awards. Like the federally approved indirect cost rate, applicants using this method will enter the details in eGrants as directed in the application instructions. Regardless of the method used, the AmeriCorps share of administrative costs is always limited to 5% of total AmeriCorps award funds expended. Guidance for calculating these costs using each of the methods is in the application instructions. Please pay close attention to the calculation guidance to avoid having to correct your calculations during the resolution process. Now it's time to review some indirect cost line items. This first example shows a state subapplicant using the corporation fixed or 510 percentage option and claiming 4% of the AmeriCorps share, with the State Service Commission electing to retain 1% of the indirect costs as allowed by the application instructions. Know that this 1% isn't an additional 1% on top of the 5% budgeted to the applicant. It is 1% of the total, with that extra 4% being budgeted to the applicant. The formula for calculating the maximum amounts in these lines are included in the application instructions and demonstrated here. The second example shows an applicant with a federally approved indirect cost rate. As requested in the application instructions, they provided the cost type, the basis on which it is calculated, the approved rate, and the rate claimed, and they detailed the cost calculation. In this example, the rate is based on total salaries and fringe benefits. And while we didn't review these sections of the budget narrative, if you look at the sample budget that accompanies this training, you will see that these two budget sections total $89,279. The applicant multiplied that by the approved rate of 48.5% to get the maximum allowable indirect cost total of $43,300. In this example, however, the applicant is choosing to claim just 45% for a budgeted total of $40,176. Again, the AmeriCorps share of indirect costs is limited to 5% of the total AmeriCorps share of costs. As we saw in the previous example, that total is $54,593. So we know that the budgeted $40,176 does not exceed that maximum allowable amount. If this was a state subapplicant and the commission was retaining a portion of the indirect costs, the applicant would either note that in the commission line of Section 1A, as shown in the first example, or make a note in this line stating that the commission was retaining 1% or 2% of the AmeriCorps share of costs. And as a reminder, applicants using a negotiated indirect cost rate must enter the details of that rate in eGrants using the guidance in the application instructions, and make sure to calculate the cost using the details of that rate. I do want to note, if you applied for a federally negotiated indirect cost rate and it has not yet been approved, you should use the corporation fixed percentage or the de minimis rate to budget any indirect costs, knowing that you can revise your budget when the negotiated rate is approved. Similarly, applicants who have an approved rate that expired or will soon expire and you're waiting for that renewal should note that the new approval is pending and provide an expected approval date in the budget narrative. If the rate is not approved by the time of award, AmeriCorps may request that you revise the budget using either the fixed percentage rate or the de minimis rate. In rare circumstances, AmeriCorps may approve the award with a special condition to amend the budget upon approval of a new rate. The last section of the budget narrative is the source of funds section. In it, applicants won't list budget sections or line item costs. Rather, they will enter the source of any matching resources included in the proposed budget. As I previously noted, applicants are only required to complete this section if they include expenses in the grantee share of the budget. To complete this section, under the Budget Section 3 tab, applicants will find a link to enter source of matching funds, as shown here. Once applicants click that link, a new screen will open for applicants to enter the source. Please be sure to note the source of the match and whether the resource is secured or proposed, the amount of match, the classification, whether that's cash or in-kind resources, and the type of source, whether it's private, state or local, or federal in that appropriate field. I caution you to update this section as well as the indirect cost section after making any budget revisions so that the totals reflect any changes made in your budgets. The total in this section must equal the total amount of any budgeted match exactly. And again, you will only complete this section if you are including any grantee share in your budget. When complete, the source of funds section might include content similar to this example. Note that this only includes the source of match, not the specific sections or line items that are covered by matching resources. And it provides all of the required details, noting whether those funds are secured or proposed, in kind or cash, and provided by a private or a government entity. When completing this section, please take care as you use the drop-down menus. It's really easy to change the selected type of source, and incorrectly entering the source may result in a request for you to clarify it during the resolution process. As long as we're discussing matching resources, I do want to remind you that if a cost is unallowable as part of the AmeriCorps share, it is also unallowable as part of the grantee share or the budgeted match. And again, if you are not sure if a cost is allowable or not, the uniform guidance is the best place to find the answer. Before I close, I want to offer a few pointers, beginning with guidance to check and double check your work to eliminate erroneous information. As I previously noted, I want to stress the benefits of involving your team and someone outside of your team in the budget development and review process. And I strongly recommend using the tips on this visual and in the budget checklist found in attachment F of the application instructions to make sure that you submit an accurate budget narrative that meets the AmeriCorps requirements. Highlights of the budget checklist include a check to make sure it meets the AmeriCorps cost guidelines. Is the full-time living allowance within the minimum and maximum levels, that is between $17,600 and $35,200 per member? Is the cost per MSY less than or equal to $28,800? While eGrants will calculate this for you, applicants can get a head start on determining the cost per MSY by dividing the total amount of AmeriCorps funds requested by the total number of MSYs requested. For example, if the application is for $100,000 in AmeriCorps funds and 10 MSYs, then the cost per MSY is $10,000. Note that the cost per MSY does not include childcare or the cost of the Siegel Education Award that a member may earn, since those costs are excluded from the budget. When applicable, does the source of matching funds provide all required information and align with any budgeted match? Exactly. Applicants will also want to check that the budget includes all required costs such as member gear, National Service criminal history checks, member FICA, and full-time member health care, along with those costs that AmeriCorps strongly encourages applicants to include, such as AmeriCorps technical assistance meetings and new staff attendance at the AmeriCorps Symposium pre-conference events. And as much as possible, due to eGrants character limits, the budget narrative should provide detail, including the purpose and accurate calculations to exclude unallowable costs. I recommend that applicants use $0 line items to enter additional information as needed. And please do have someone check all of your calculations before you submit your budget. Finally, and most importantly, applicants should ensure that they aligned the budget narrative to the program goals in the application narrative, including miscellaneous, contingency, or other undefined budget amounts may adversely impact your application status. In addition, before submitting your application, Please make sure your organization has an active registration with the System for Award Management. All applicants must register with the System for Award Management at sam.gov and maintain an active SAM registration until the application process is complete. If an applicant is awarded a grant, it must maintain an active SAM registration throughout the life of the award. I recommend that applicants applying to SAM for the first time apply early, as it may take a while to activate the registration. AmeriCorps recommends that you apply for or renew your registration at least 3 weeks prior to the application deadline to allow time to resolve any issues that may arise. Applicants must use their SAM registered legal name, physical address, and unique entity identifier, or UEI, on all grant applications to AmeriCorps, and the legal applicant name and address in eGrants must match what is on file in SAM exactly. Please be aware that SAM is a free service. Organizations should never pay for a SAM registration. If you are a new or recompeting applicant, please make sure to submit your Operational and Financial Management Survey, or OFMS, as instructed on the Funding Opportunity page. Applicants must also submit their most recent single audit to the Federal Audit Clearinghouse and Form 990 to GuideStar as required. And please remember to enter your current federally negotiated indirect cost rate details, if you have one, in eGrants. Details for all of these actions are on the Public Health AmeriCorps Funding Opportunity page of AmeriCorps.gov. Finally, AmeriCorps is aware that on occasion, applicants experience challenges with the eGrant system. eGrants automatically performs a limited compliance check to validate the budget, and it may result in a warning or error message. Some of these messages prevent applicants from submitting the application, so you should be aware of the differences and the related actions. For instance, when you receive a warning, you can move forward, but the application or budget may not be compliant with the guidelines. On the other hand, an error message will not allow applicants to move forward until they correct the error. Applicants must resolve all errors before they can submit the application. If you experience a challenge other than a warning or error message, you should contact the AmeriCorps hotline right away. The number is 800-942-2677, and a link to the help request form is at the bottom of most eGrants pages. It's wise to forward a copy of the service ticket to AmeriCorps Grants at cns.gov so AmeriCorps has documentation of the problem. I want to draw your attention back to these bullets that I shared earlier. I encourage applicants to keep this checklist nearby as they develop their budget and frequently consult it as a budget development guide and quality assurance checklist. Many budgets require extensive revisions, in part because applicants do not follow the points outlined here. You will save yourself a great deal of follow-up effort by checking your proposed budget against this checklist before submitting it to AmeriCorps. As a reminder, AmeriCorps is hosting a live budget development office hour on Wednesday, December 7th from 2:30 to 3:30 p.m. Eastern Time. A link to the registration for that call is on this slide and on the fiscal year 2023 AmeriCorps State and National Funding page. Again, I thank you for your time and your interest in Public Health AmeriCorps, and I wish you all the best in the competition.